Now I am death, destroyer of worlds. These were the words of Robert Oppenheimer when he witnessed the detonation of the first nuclear weapon. I suspect the words of Steve Jobs were a little less dramatic when he held the first iPhone. Yet transistor-based technology such as the iPhone has had a greater impact on diplomacy than any person, country, or weapon in history. Today, we are joined by the world's premier experts in democracy, green energy, national security, and more to discuss how technology is playing a pivotal role in the fields they study. Welcome, everyone, to the 2022 AHS Tech Conference. My name is Jake Merritt, and I'm the president of the Alexander Hamilton Society here at the George Washington University. The AHS is a nonpartisan international affairs debate and discussion society. We host speaker events, reading series, gatherings, and more. If this is your first time at AHS, or if you just want to learn more, or if your roommate won't stop snoring and you're just having a really rough time, be sure to talk to one of our reps at the table outside. Today's conference is a radical departure from our typical format. We have speakers and panels throughout the day covering careers in the intelligence community, nuclear and missile technology, green energy cooperation, and the future of combat. All of those events will take place in the Elliott School later today. For additional details on speakers, times, locations, and more, you can check out our website, ahstechevent.com, or speak to a representative at the table outside after the event. Before we begin, I would like to thank all of those who helped put on our event today. This could not happen without the assistance of the George Washington University, the Alexander Hamilton Society National Organization, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and of course, our world-class speakers joining us today. I'd like to give a special thanks to our conference sponsor, FADA Advisory. FADA Advisory is a firm focused on helping companies and organizations operating in the aerospace and defense, public, and NGO sectors enhance their product and program offerings and secure market positions. We are extremely grateful for their sponsorship of the 2022 AHS Tech Conference. With that, I'm very excited to get this thing underway, and to introduce our speakers, I'd like to invite up Parker Phillips, our Director of Communications.
Thank you. So today we have Sam Greene, who was recently named Director of the Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Dr. Greene brings expertise on how authoritarian regimes maintain power through media and digital technology. Greene was a professor in Russian politics and the director of the Russian Institute at the King's College London. Prior to King's, he lived and worked in Moscow for 13 years, most recently as the director of the Center for the Study of New Media and Society at the New Economics School, and as deputy director in the Carnegie Moscow Center. He holds a PhD in political sociology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Our other speaker, Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, serves as the executive vice president of Freedom House, where she oversees the organization's strategy and programs. Prior to joining Freedom House, Ms. Bibbins Sedaca served as the deputy director of Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program, and is the co-chair for the Global Politics and Security Concentration, and was a professor of the practice of international affairs. She served for 10 years in the State Department, working on democracy promotion, human rights, human trafficking, religious freedom, refugees, and counterterrorism. Her positions included the Senior Advisor for the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, and the Senior Director for Strategic Planning and External Affairs at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Ms. Bibbins Sedaca holds a master's degree from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. I had the pleasure of working with Ms. Bibbins Sedaca last year on her TED Talk at the GW's TEDx Foggy Bottom, and I'm delighted to have her back on the GW stage. Our other speaker and moderator for tonight is Dr. Robert Sutter, a professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School. In addition to his accomplished career as a China expert, Dr. Sutter has also spent over 30 years in public service. During that time, he served as a senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division at the Congressional Research Service. He has also served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the National Intelligence Council, and the China Division Director at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He also served as a professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He received his PhD from Harvard, but the most impressive line in his resume is serving as our faculty advisor. So from the entire GW chapter of AHS, we would like to thank you for all of your guidance and thank you for moderating this event. We are very lucky to have these three accomplished professionals speak with us today. Please give them a round of applause, and Dr. Sutter, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. This is the beginning of a very interesting day. I think the society, the chapter, should be really congratulated for coming up with such an important idea to expose us all to. And this panel is look at the expertise on both sides of me. It's just amazing what we're going to be experiencing. So I'm just pretty excited about all this. But I am a China specialist, and so I'm more excited because of that too. Because what we find, this is so timely. I can't get over how timely this is, in a sense, from a policy point of view. My career has been working with policy a lot of ways in Congress and in the executive branch. And what you find today is that China is such is on the People's Republic of China, the party state of China, is very much on the other side on this issue. So take a look, if you would, on President Biden's national security strategy. That just came out this week, and that underlines the commitment this government has toward that democracy, human rights, and these types of things, and points to China as the opponent, the leading opponent of this sort of, on these sorts of issues. And so this is something that's really worth considering. And in addition, we just have a flurry of, I wouldn't say a flurry, a wave of activity in the administration taking a much tougher line toward China on these issues that we're going to be talking about today. At the same time, we find that we're just on the cusp of a Congress in China, where the leader of China, who is the leader pushing the policies on the other side, is now going to be installed for another 5 years. And so we're really right in the middle of a very important turning point, if you will. I'm not sure how it's all going to work out in many instances, but something that's quite important to understand. And so we're going to try to understand that today. And you don't have to be a China specialist to be excited about this, but it helps. I just want to add that to you. And if you think the U.S.-China relationship is going to be important in the future, which I do, then this really helps. So I'm glad we're able to do this today. So what I'd like to do is the plan is that each of the speakers will speak first for several minutes. Then we'll have a conversation among ourselves for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor. And that will be, I think, will be guided by people from the Alexander Hamilton Society on this sort of thing as to when we should stop and that type of thing. So, but I'd like to, so then I would like to turn it over, and I think, we've agreed among ourselves at least to be on a first name basis. You have the bios, and they were very nicely introduced. So I'm going to turn to Nicole to lead us off and give her remarks, and then we'll turn to Sam and get his remarks. And so Nicole, please.
Excellent. Thank you. And it's really, really wonderful to be here. It's just great because I feel like GW is a second home for me now, as I said. And when I hear people introducing like nonpartisan, international, and debate, like my wonky self is just delighted in all ways. So thank you to the Alexander Hamilton Society, because I think that creating this space is such an important part of your time as a student or within a community here. And so just thank you for fostering that conversation. It's really extraordinarily important. What I'd love to do is talk a little bit, we're talking about technology, but I want to also look at it sort of in the broader perspective of what's going on in the world, sort of what's the geopolitical background that is behind much of the conversation you'll hear today. So I work for an organization called Freedom House. We work to expand and defend freedom and democracy around the world, at home and abroad. And what we know is, as we're looking around the world, we are in the 16th year of consistent democratic decline in the world, which means there are more countries in which democracy and freedom is facing challenge and regressing compared to just a fewer number that are going forward and progressing. And so we are unquestionably in a place where there is a pitched battle between democracy and authoritarian governments around the world. And I say that as an opening because we're going to talk about very specific things about digital authoritarianism and technology and the different elements of that, but it's really important to understand that all of our conversation today very much sits within this larger perspective of democracy, democratic norms that exist in the world, and authoritarian governments, which are increasingly seeking to undermine those norms, to restrict those freedoms, but really to change the rules of the road. And there are a lot of places where they are being very, very successful, and it's something that we have to understand in the bigger picture. As we look around the world, we look at countries and rank them in our reporting as free, partly free, and not free. And what we know now is the percentage of people in the world that are living in free countries is 20%. 20%, like if I had just guessed and not seen our reports, I would have been like, I don't know, probably 60, 70, something around there, but 20% live in free countries, which means 80% are living in a place where they don't enjoy the freedom to post online what they think. Think about all the things which we post online, critiquing our government, critiquing a social policy, critiquing a decision in a court or in an election or something. That is not a freedom that is shared by the vast majority of people around the world. So let me just switch it over more specifically to our conversation today, and to say authoritarian governments, which are in a pitched battle against democracy and democratic norms, are unquestionably realizing that the digital space is a great place. It's a new tool, not new, but newer tool for them to use. And what we're seeing around the world is governments that are breaking apart the global internet to create more controlled online spaces. Because if you can control one online space and you can control the access and connectivity that people have, you do have a tremendous amount of control over their knowledge and their information. What we've seen in a lot of places is when you have that connectivity, you have people who are aware of the freedoms that are being experienced in other parts of the world, and that is fuel for their desire and their efforts to bring freedom in their own place. And where you have a limited amount of information coming out, people are not seeing the repression that people are facing on a day-to-day basis. I will do a little shameless plugging here. Next Tuesday, I would love for all of you to take a look. We're releasing a report called Freedom on the Net. It is very much about what we're talking about here, but it'll give a great opportunity for you all. We'll have an event that you can participate in online, or just read the report. It's a great way to just dig into the latest research that we've done on this. But just to talk more broadly, we have seen a stunning decline in the right to freedom of expression and access to information. And what that means is where we all have the benefit of being able to find any bit of information online, there are many, many people in the world who have such a limited access to the internet or to different places on the internet that they are not able to access the information that they need on a daily basis, and certainly not able to get their voices out. And what we've seen is a lot of governments going after people who are utilizing, who are trying to use the internet as the place to voice their views. I'll just give it a few examples. In Myanmar this summer, we saw an activist, Kyaw Min Yu, who went online to post a condemnation of the military's crackdown, and he was arrested and executed. And when you think about it, we post so much online critiquing our government, critiquing what happened in local, and here's a person who critiqued an entire takeover of a country and was executed simply for putting that online. We've seen in Rwanda, Nigeria, sentences of 15 to 25 years for people who've gone online just to advocate for very basic things like COVID vaccinations and access to health care. We are also seeing that governments are using internet controls to try and limit independent reporting, journalists' voices, documentation of human rights abuses, and the opportunities for people to organize during periods of political turmoil. If you look at what Russia is doing now to limit the information, they have widespread blocks on international social media platforms since their invasion of Ukraine. Same thing as we're seeing Iranian protesters so courageously going to the streets to protest the murder of Mahsa Amini just a few weeks ago. Iran is also shutting down the internet in so many places in order to silence and ensure people don't have access to information. Last year in our Freedom on the Net report, we also focused on the global drive to control big tech, because what we're seeing is that authorities in so many countries, and we documented 48 in the last year, have passed new regulations and rules for tech companies on their content and data and competition. And there are real problems on the internet that need to be regulated, but what we're seeing is that good faith attempts at legal and transparent regulation are an exception and not the rule. And what is far more common is authoritarian governments that are trying to regulate tech companies in order to use them as a tool of their own repression. Last point, and then I think I could talk for many, many hours on this, but last point, and then would love to hear what my colleagues have to say. We also know that digital technology is being used to help drive what we're calling transnational repression, which is authoritarian governments not just limiting their repression to people who are in their own society and living on their territory, but really going above and beyond. If we all remember the murder of Jamal Khashoggi a few years ago, a journalist, American permanent resident, and Saudi citizen who was murdered by the Saudi government in Turkey. That's transnational repression. That is reaching beyond a government's borders to go after dissidents and activists. And what we're seeing is technology gives a much easier way, because you don't have to put anyone on a plane to do it. You can reach out through technology to harass people, to intimidate families, and to go after people wherever they may be, including in democracies. And so we're really seeing technology being used in a lot of creative ways by authoritarian governments. So looking forward to unpacking that, certainly looking at China, looking at Russia, and many other places. But with that, I'll stop and look forward to my colleagues' comments as well.
Sam, you're up.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. Apologies, I'm the reason that we started late, and so I'll try to be brief now so we can get into the conversation. Agree with everything that Nicole said, which doesn't always happen on a panel, and we might find things to disagree with down the road. But I want to come at things from a slightly different angle. Right? There's an election in this country, right, in about 3 weeks. You didn't hear that from me for the first time, I'm assuming. Can I just see a show of hands? I don't get to do this. I'm not in the classroom as much anymore as I used to be. So I get a show of hands and keep them up. If you regularly consume news, right, about this election, relevant to this election at GW, I would expect that everybody raised their hand. Right now, keep your hands up for a second. Keep your hand up now if that news that you're consuming has shaped a decision about who you're going to vote for in 3 weeks. Okay, I'd say there's probably maybe a half to a third of the hands up. This is a midterm election, there's a lot of down ballot races, right? So that's going to happen. You can put your hands down now, sorry. And thanks to the panelists, you should participate.
Rule followers.
A lot of you are probably political science students, right? You read what it says in your political science textbooks about, and not just textbooks, but a lot of the actual research about why people consume the news, right? The underlying assumption is that it's because we want to make decisions, right? We're aware of this election every couple of years, right? And we're going to have to walk into that ballot box and make a decision about who we're going to vote for. And so we want information, and we engage in what political scientists call Bayesian preference updating, right? That we're constantly getting new information to get our preferences closer and closer and closer to what we think is in our interest. We want to make the vote that's going to get us where we want to go. What we've just, I think, realized, and it probably only takes about 5 minutes to figure this out, right, is that it's probably not most of the reason that most of us are consuming the news most of the time. Every once in a while, that's true. Every once in a while, there's a down ballot race or something where we don't have a preference to begin with, or we don't already know who we think is who we're going to vote for, particularly in primaries, right, maybe. But often, right, we're reading the news for a very different reason, and it tends to be because we want to socialize, right? Because we want to win the dinner party, because we want to be able to have conversations with people in our social circle about what's going on in the world, right? And being able to talk about what's going on in the world is a very important part of us communicating to those other people, right? That we are normal, reliable, members of society, trustworthy members of our social groups, that we're also interesting and fun to be with, and that kind of thing, right? And those social incentives, right, have always shaped the decisions that we make about consuming the news. It's one of the reasons why if I have a group of people around me, right, who get most of their news from NPR and the New York Times, I'm not going to consume Tucker Carlson, not because I disagree with him, right, because it's socially useless to me, right? If I walk into that conversation with all of my NPR listening friends and say, well, Tucker said, right, that's going to be the end of those relationships, right, and I'm going to feel rather uncomfortable. So, so this idea of polarization, us being grouped into camps, right, is not a new thing. So where does the social media, where does the digital media come into all of this? From our perspective, again, everything, I would agree with everything that Nicole said about the big structural issues and the geopolitical issues. But coming at it from the perspective of an individual and as a citizen, right? At the end of the day, these are the people that are being affected by this, right? The social incentives are not new, right? Digital media, however, are playing an important role, right, in reshaping those social incentives, right? There's not actually a lot of evidence to say that they're creating new polarization. But they are changing what we're aware of in terms of the world, right? And they're creating often a lot more homogeneity. We used to think about the internet as something that was creating a much more varied picture of the world. And before we had algorithms, right, that was true, right? You all of a sudden had access to information and ideas and people that you didn't have access to before, right? With the advent of algorithms and the monetization of those algorithms, we land in a place where, in fact, in a lot of ways, the world that we're all exposed to is much narrower than it used to be. So there's that, right, that we need to be aware of. Also changes our incentives in terms of the social groups that we want to interact with. Right? It used to be that we just wanted to perform and be in touch with our narrow social group, people that you see in the classroom, in the dormitory, or wherever else. Right now, there's a whole world out there, right, that we want to engage with. And not be canceled by, and get a response from, right? And in this, these two things come together, right? So this performing for the world, but it's also a narrow world in some ways because of what we're being exposed to as a result of algorithms. As a result, now most of the times I turn on Facebook, right, which is way too often. I get an ad that says Facebook is the problem, right? Interesting, something Mark Zuckerberg is making money off of that, right? But and I can see the point, right? And we do see the point, but I'm not entirely sure it's true. Because again, this is not an entirely new phenomenon, right? Us being sort of herded into little boxes, the boxes are a little bit differently shaped now, right? And in some ways more constricting, and in some ways more problematic because we're not as aware of the ways in which we're being constricted as the ways that we had learned to think about sort of the restrictions on what television might tell us or what newspapers might tell us, right? Whether we're living in a democratic society or an authoritarian society, right? We kind of knew how that worked. The algorithms are much more opaque. They're much less visible to us. And so we're not in as good a position at least yet, right, to think about how we need to respond to that. And that's all true, right? But there's always been this tension, right, between our consumption of news for the purpose of socialization, which is going to put us in these boxes, right, and our consumption of news for the purpose of actually making decisions, right? So Vladimir Putin announces that he's going to mobilize 300,000, maybe 1.2 million Russians to go fight in the war, right? And all of a sudden people need new information. So despite all of the authoritarianism, right, despite all of the restrictions, people are going to go on, they're going to turn off the television for a moment because they know what the television is going to tell them. And what the television tells them is great for participating in those kitchen table conversations and projecting that I'm a normal, loyal Russian citizen, which in a state where if you're not loyal, you can go to jail for a long time, is important, right? But also not dying is kind of important, right? And not having to participate in a war that you don't necessarily believe in is kind of important, right? So you're going to go and you're going to find a VPN, right? Although you can't use your credit card anymore to pay for it. That's a conversation to have with the State Department. But you're going to do that, right? Because you're going to get this information because it does matter, because you do have to make a decision, right? So if we want to know also something about why, again, in democracies or authoritarian settings, people are sometimes dragged along by the media dynamics and somehow become divorced from what we would think of as their real interests, right? Whether it's standing up to an authoritarian leader or getting a vaccine. We need to think about, well, what else might it be, right? That's driving people away from this. If there's always been this push and pull between sort of our social incentives as media consumers and our interests, right, as citizens, right? Has something broken down in our sense of citizenship of what we can get from the state, what we expect to be able to get from political participation. Right? That means that somehow now that side of the equation, right, that cup in the scales is just less weighty than it used to be. So I think there's a danger sometimes that we pretend that because we can see all of these problems being manifested in the digital space and in the media space, that we think if we can just fix the digital space and the media space, all the other problems are going away. They're not. Right? They're not going to go away. They're still going to be there. And in fact, we're probably not going to be able to solve the media problems unless we can address these other problems of citizenship at the same time, if not first. But I'll stop there and get into the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you both. That's wonderful. I think we have two big questions here, and and the first one has to do with the geopolitical consequences of particularly authoritarian states carrying out the practices that you've indicated. So maybe we can take that one first. But then Sam's emphasis. It seems that you didn't directly point to this, but I think you really look at the United States and other developed countries having this problem and how it impacts the freedom, if you will, and the good governance that might flow from this. So I'd like you to develop. That seems to be a very big problem, and so then we can each. So why don't you, if you would, Nicole, if you would start us off with your comments, that would be great, and then we can talk about that, and then we can talk about this issue, and then you can talk, and then we can find other issues to talk about.
And so the question then is, how is technology impacting these specific geopolitical, or tell me
how they're using it?
Yeah.
How they're using it.
Yeah.
In other words, they're your figures show they're winning. You know what I mean? The democracy's declining. I mean, when I look at a country like China, they have such tight. I really admire them. They're so good at this, of gaining control over the communication in their country. And so it's just remarkable.
Yeah.
And so these efforts by Putin and others look so clumsy when you compare it to how China does it. Right. It's very sophisticated and effective. So you really, so this argument that you have that this is a problem is, yes, it is, and because you have particularly in the case of China, you have a party state that is very good at this, and so using the technology, using the internet to support themselves.
Yeah, I think it's important as we think about like the role of technology, the role of social media companies, is to recognize that these are tools. They are not the end in and of themselves, right? And so, and I'm hearkening back as formerly an ethics professor at Georgetown, like the motivation and the intention, the moral framework behind the use of a tool is your starting place. Because a tool is a tool, right? The internet, social media platforms, I can think of so many great reasons. Like we knew about a lot of social movements around the world because I could pick up my phone and see them. People knew about other activism that was going on in the world because they could see it happening in real time. And I can think of a lot of social ills that I'm aware of or that have come to me that I did not seek out because they show up on my phone. So when we think about these things, what we have to think about is not just the tool, but the user, right? And the user is governments, and I'll go to pick up on Sam's point, is that we have to ask ourselves about some of these questions about citizenship, about the quality of government and the quality of the user and not just the tool. We do have to think about the tool, how the tool is regulated, who is in that space and making decisions about them, but we also have to focus on the fact that an authoritarian government is going to look for any tool that they can. If that tool is imprisoning people in old school ways to throw people as political prisoners, great, let's do that. If they can do it through social media and they can do it through limiting the space that people have to access to information or going after people through surveillance or other ways, great, we'll do that. And so then we have to say, who are the actors? And here I would say democracies, I would say social media companies, I would say civil society, lots of different actors that have to say, what is our role in setting the parameters for the use of these technologies so that they are used, or at least limited in their use, for the proper the proper game. We're not going to roll back technology. We're not going to roll back social media. What we need to do is then think about what the right use is and then build the infrastructure around it, or the limitations, or the right platforms for us to be able to use it in a way which is consistent with the values that we want in a democratically governed world.
Great. Sam, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I again absolutely agree with that. But the users aren't, even in autocratic settings, the users that are creating autocratic outcomes, right, from digital technology aren't only governments, right?
Yeah.
So if you take a look at a place like India, for example, right? So I mentioned Telegram has been very important, as has WhatsApp groups, right, for now Russians fleeing the draft, right, trying to find their way to Mongolia or Kazakhstan or wherever they can get to, since Europe is mostly closed. The same WhatsApp, right, and Viber and these sorts of messaging apps have been extremely important in creating Modi's authoritarianism in India, right? Not because the government does it directly, right, but because it's empowered groups that themselves have been empowered by the Hindutva nationalism that's been at the core of Modi's appeal, right, to harass would-be political opponents, right, to cow people into withdrawing from the political space, to make it very difficult to be other, right, in India, whether that's politically, ethnically, religiously, or what have you, and that then contributes to Modi's power base. Is that something that Modi's told people to go out and do? No. Is it something he's enabled them and empowered them to do? Yes, right. Authoritarian leaders are not, in the 21st century, ideologically committed to a mode of power, right? They are very opportunistic. They will pick up on whatever is available to them, and if that's millions or hundreds of millions of people, and you talk about getting to 20% living in non-freedom, right? It only takes India to go sort of over that line to really drive the numbers, or Brazil, right, where we see also very similar dynamics with the use of these messaging apps to really make the political space a very unpleasant space, right, to be an opposition supporter in Brazil, right? So this is part of it, right? I think getting to the question of, well, what can we do about it? I think there's a real tension, right, in that we use social media, and we expect social media to be used as though they were a public good, right? These digital spaces that connect us to everybody. But they're governed and regulated, managed, and owned as private corporations, right? That have to be regulated as such and responsible to shareholders and financial markets, so that when a social media company, right? Okay, for example, right, the last elections but one in Russia, right? Russian opposition put together an initiative called Smart Voting, right? Which involved an app, right, that was available through Android and Apple, right? That would allow people to basically put in their local district, right, and find out who they should be voting for, right, and which of the various non-Kremlin candidates, right, had the best chance of winning. It was an approach to strategic voting. It's in all of your political science textbooks, right? And it would have worked, and it had worked in the past, right? So the Kremlin didn't want to deal with it. So what do? They get on the phone to Apple and Google and say, get this app out of the app store, right? Or you're going to be out of the country. Right? And this is a market that you still care about despite everything that's happened. And if you don't do that, you have employees in Russia, and we'll put them in jail, right? So that puts these corporations in a very difficult position. Right? Again, corporations that are expected to adhere to the laws in each jurisdiction in which they work. Right? So again, I think there's a conversation to be had in Washington, in Brussels, and other jurisdictions where we actually care about the public goods aspect of this, right? To either find a new way of regulating these companies, right? So that the infrastructure is somehow available regardless of what other jurisdictions are doing, right? Or to backstop them. Right, so that when they can then push back. The same, because we have legislation, right, that allows companies to say, no, I can't, Mr. Putin, pay you a bribe, because we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or the UK Bribery Act, right? And so you have to respect that, right? We don't have anything like that for the digital space. I think it takes some creativity, but I think there are opportunities there.
Wow, boy, this is such a big problem in so many ways. This broad sense of it wasn't 20 years ago. We thought I remember doing a national intelligence estimate on China, over 20 years ago. And we said the internet was a source of liberalization. And this was 16 intelligence agencies said yes, that's what it is. It's a source of liberalization. That was in 2000, so that wasn't 20 years ago. And now I'm really perplexed because I'm not sure if we can defeat this trend of authoritarian leaders looking at this. And Sam, your discussion of the internal situation in developed countries suggests that too is subject to manipulation and can be used in various ways, even if the government isn't involved, in ways that are very negative as far as democratic process is concerned. And so I'd like you to address that if you would.
Mm-hmm. I think that social media is still a form of liberalization, and it's a form that can be used by illiberal actors. And so I think a lot of the points that Sam is getting at are where we need to drill down to that next level of what would it take to ensure that the internet is free and open and that it is protected so that all people have access to it globally, and where there are regulations, but that those regulations are driven by the right motivations that we're seeing. So let me just give a couple different places where that appears. I mean, we just saw an election at the UN for the body that oversees a lot of the international regulatory framework, and we had very different candidates coming up for that. And it is not coincidental that we see authoritarian governments trying to put their leaders, it's not that the job creation that they're looking for the UN because they've got no jobs at home, they are looking strategically at positions at the United Nations, at international bodies, the UN Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, so that there is control over those bodies. We are very happy that an American, not just because it's American, but it's a person who is oriented towards democracy, won that position and has made keeping the internet free and open as part of the position. That's extraordinarily important, and we can't lose sight of those types of positions. I think to Sam's point, companies in this space are not just regular companies like companies that are producing, cookies for our kids. Well, that has a whole regulation point too, but that's a whole separate issue. But they have an extraordinarily important role, right? And so there are technologies that technology companies can be thinking about. End-to-end encryption is extraordinarily important. I think companies also need to think that they have a social responsibility, and if that means that they're incurring fines, if that means that they are having to push back on governments, that may be the conversation that they need to step into. And yes, we need to back them. We, like the governmental structures in respective governments, need to back that up. But I do think there's a conversation to be had about the responsibility of tech companies to push back. And I think we have to play out the scenario. If tech companies are not pushing back, if they just say, great, you know what do you want us to limit? We'll limit whatever you want. How that story plays out in the longer term, because if they're saying we want to stay in this market, and so we're going to do the things that an authoritarian government is asking us to, the longer term conversation is that those markets are going to close anyway. Because the more authoritarianism rolls, the more unpredictable and closed markets will be. Markets are open and subject to the greatest economic opportunity in a democracy. And so to the extent that companies are making these short-term concessions because it's in their longer-term interest is actually not a great economic argument, but it's certainly also not a great democracy argument. So what we have to do is be in conversations with these companies to say, great, it is short-term pain, and there's no doubt that it's short-term pain to push back on China or Russia or other governments, but it is about keeping economic markets open, and it is about keeping the internet free and open, because that, at the end of the day, is their business. And the more that closes, the more their economic as well as their social responsibility interests are compromised.
And I agree. I think actually the cookie example is a great one, right? Because we are aware that various things that are produced have externalities. They have consequences, right? And we worry about the public health consequences and the individual health consequences of things. We worry about the environmental consequences of things. We have, clean air and clean water protections. And I think we're only just beginning to understand the broader public consequences of some of the technology. And I think that time will catch up, right? The question pointed to a learning curve. We did start off, talking about all this stuff. There was whole literature on liberation technology, right? Which we don't really read anymore. But it's educational, and then there was an assumption that kind of it would always be as it was at the very beginning, which was kind of a rarefied space. It was only certain kinds of people that were using the internet and online technology when it began, right? And that was very liberalizing because they had a particular ethos, right, and a particular set of interests. But the governments hadn't caught up yet. Other constituencies, it turns out that illiberal groups can also use this technology because again, it's just a tool. It's there for anybody to use. So that part of it was inevitable. I do despair of kind of the current crop of people on Capitol Hill understanding the technology well enough to regulate it appropriately, but I don't despair of that eternally. I think that millennials will eventually get elected, and they'll begin to think about at least we have a crop of people on Capitol Hill who couldn't program a VCR. They'll eventually be replaced by people who don't remember a VCR, right? And I think that will come, and we need to do it carefully because there is a danger. Right? That we regulate these things in ways that are knee-jerk regulations and knee-jerk reactions, and we end up doing it also in ways that are politicized. Right? A lot of the conversations you hear, obviously now, about what the restrictions should be on the ability of social media companies to restrict speech, right, on their own platforms is a politicized conversation. Right? It's a conversation about who gets partisan advantage out of it, rather than what's actually the best thing from a First Amendment point of view. So these are going to be difficult conversations. They should be difficult conversations. There's not going to be easy answers, but I'm gratified at least that we're having the conversation.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on one of those points that you made at the beginning of your remarks just now. There's so much that we do when we're thinking as consumers also about we wouldn't do that because that's an environmentally unsound decision, right? Or I'm not going to buy that product because it was made with sweatshop labor, right? We've had those conversations, but what we have to do is push that into this space of freedom and democracy as well, right? Because if I said you're doing something or you're contributing in your consumer behavior or in a company's behavior that's contributing to one of the greatest threats, if I were to say that's greatest threats, is it environmental? People blah, 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 I'm not going to do that, right? I'm not going to contribute to something which is part of an environmental catastrophe that we see coming down the line. But if I were to say, what if you're contributing to something which is a political disaster or a governance disaster, if we know that the space is closing for the very freedoms that we enjoy, I think we need to think with the same urgency about democracy and freedom and the same comprehensive nature about those issues as I think we often do about climate, right? And that's something where we think I'm going to buy this type of car or not that type of car or make this decision. But we also have to think there is the same urgency of that governance question and that political question as I think there is about some of the environmental and social issues as well.
Still a lot of pickup trucks on the road, though.
There are, right, and there's still a lot of illiberal behavior. So we're going to push on all fronts, and but I think we need to realize that these questions are not ones that are that far down the road. But
those that use the internet to support authoritarian rule, they've been growing in their capacity to do so and their sophistication, it seems. I mean, I've just been very impressed by looking at the few authoritarian governments that I look at, and I said, my God, this is an amazing phenomenon. And you haven't really addressed which way is the trend going. In other words, are we really moving toward the advantage with the authoritarians, or will a fair, open internet continue to be a useful mechanism in the world? I mean, I'm very, very puzzled by this because I think the trend. I'm pessimistic. I mean, I say, my God, look at this. I mean, and China's spreading this all over the world. They're teaching people how to do all of this in various places. And of course, you have a lot of clumsy authoritarian rules, and so it doesn't work very well. But you look at, up and coming, sort of fragile democratic societies. They can be easily reversed in various ways through effective manipulation of the internet. So I'm just curious about that.
I'm a both and. I'm a glass half empty and glass half full type of person. We just released a report called Beijing's Global Media Influence, which looks at how the Chinese Communist Party is really manipulating media environments throughout the world to ensure that there is a positive narrative that looks very natural in the media environments in a lot of other countries, but it's actually a lot of propaganda and a lot of influence that they're exerting over local media companies and organizations throughout the world. And so what I know from that and from many other the information out there is the threat's real. I mean, the threat and the very organized, systematic effort to close and segment the internet is extremely real. I mean, the candidacy at the United Nations was not just, oh, we happen to see a job opening and we're going to throw an application in there. There was a very systematic, organized campaign to limit information, to control access to information, and to limit free speech online. There is zero doubt about it. And I am hopeful because we have the ability to push back, right? We don't lack information. We don't lack on the resources and the brains to do it. What we need is to really mobilize and feel that sense of urgency. And what we also have to do within democracies, and this is a challenge of a free and open society, is we have to realize the urgency and the degree of the threat, get over some of our own issues in order to mobilize the same systematic response that it's coming at us. In an authoritarian, you can mobilize any resources very fast because there's only like 2 people making decisions. We obviously have to have a broader debate within a democracy and with other democracies, and that's messy and long and hard, but we need to realize that there's an urgency at the door, and that now is the time for us not to be bickering left and right, but to say we're going to come together and have a very strategic and a strategic plan that involves companies, that involves civil society, and that involves governments really working together to keep the internet free and open.
Great.
So look, I think it was absolutely a mistake to have thought that the advent of digital technology was going to put authoritarians at a structural disadvantage. Right? They were going to catch up, and they did. But I think it's also a mistake to think that digital technology is giving authoritarians a structural advantage. I think they do create challenges for themselves. They can get very good at using, as can people in non-authoritarian environments, right? At using the internet for persuasion, for channeling public opinion, and getting people to behave in ways that they want to, and for creating compliance, right? And surveillance and coercion is a big part of that. But I think what's interesting is it's becoming an increasingly big part of that, and not just because the technology is getting better, but because it's something that increasingly authoritarian regimes are finding they need, right? So what we've seen over a lot of the 21st century is that authoritarianism has been a lot less about fear and a lot more about persuasion and co-optation, right? But that in the last couple of years has begun to change, right? As we've seen particularly older authoritarian regimes, particularly post-Soviet authoritarian regimes like Russia, right, find that their powers of persuasion diminish, particularly as people stay in power for longer, they lose touch, they lose contact, and they have to turn more and more to fear, and they have to turn more and more to coercion. They use digital technology to help that, but that in some ways makes politics a lot more real to people, right? So you can no longer say, well, I can just kind of ignore all of this, right? And I can just consume the news for the purpose of socialization. All of a sudden now I need to consume the news for the purpose of keeping myself alive, right? Keeping myself out of jail, keeping myself off the front lines in a war that I don't want to fight in, right? And so as authoritarianism becomes sharper, yes, they'll have the digital tools to use, but they will also create the desire to use those same digital tools for resistance. So in the long run, I'm reasonably optimistic.
Are we ready for student for audience participation? I mean, we have a lot of hands up already.
Okay, I'm going to take one of you guys' mics, just so we can hear everything.
Oh, I see. I thought you were going to... managed to hear.
Hi there, super excited to be here. I'm a second-year graduate student actually in the School of Engineering. My major is cyber engineering and policy. I'm also the co-founder of Women in Cybersecurity here at GW. The question that I have for you all is, as you know, in 2022, China's a party state. They declared the new terminology, well, in my opinion, it's the new terminology of cyber sovereignty, right? And so with what President Biden released this week, I kind of wanted to know your opinions between, you know, these two very contrasting ideas. And as you said, you know, China's point of view really is more about influence, right? And these are two very different approaches to governance in cyberspace that we're going to look at in the future. And you know, shout out to Nicole, you're a really cool person. I hope to talk to you after this. Yeah, so that's my question.
I would love to just jump in. Sovereignty is one of my favorite things to talk about. That may make my cool points go down really quickly. But sovereignty is a great concept as far as territorial sovereignty, right? As far as like, okay, we've got to govern this piece of land. But there is no sovereignty borders of information, right? And so China is using terms like cyber sovereignty to say, well, no, but you know, just as our borders end here, so does the information flow. We've long passed that debate, and what they're trying to do is shift the debate by inserting these concepts that we're going to have to draw borders on information the way we have drawn borders on where I can go with my passport or not. We have to push back on those ideas just conceptually, because the free flow of information, first off, the train has left the station, right? There's been a free flow of information for a very long time, since radio enabled people to listen to information further than just their neighbor's house. But it's also, we just have to say that the internet has to stay open and free for all people, and that the concept of putting up walls on information is not something that's consistent with a international system that's based on norms of free flow of information, free access of information.
If I could just add briefly about China, China is in the process of legitimating its practices internationally.
Yeah.
And so this is a big challenge in governance, and it's very well articulated in the national security strategy of the Biden administration. They get it. They understand this. The folks in the UN, the Chinese are the second largest donor to the United Nations in money. That makes them matter. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative, which is full of this kind of control in various ways. It's a leading edge of how the Chinese party state is able to influence governance across the world to undertake these kinds of internet policies. And the Chinese are very active in building their priorities in the infrastructure of the United Nations. So the United Nations is very close to China. It pays its dues. The United States has higher dues, but they don't pay on time. The Chinese pay on time. So to get real here, you see what I'm talking about? How this danger that I see. But the Biden government recognizes this. The Congress has recognized this for a long time in their crude way. But they did this, and they try to counter it as best they can. They're trying to defend America. It's a very serious problem, is my point.
Can I just add one point to that, which is not just a point about digital. We set a lot of rules of the international order in 1945 to 1948, in that 53, in that era. A lot of years have passed, and a lot of people are like, well, it's not really outdated. I really fundamentally believe that your generation is going to rewrite, update, toss out, keep a lot of those rules and institutions. And you've got to think hard about what you're going to rewrite. And you've got to think very hard about what you're going to. China is very actively undermining and rewriting the rules little by little. And if we're not, and what we need to do is, yes, things written in 1945 or 1948, a little bit old, might need to be outdated, but the values behind them don't need to go out. The institutions might need to be updated, but the values don't. The values of freedom, the values of open freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of media, those don't need to go. But what we need to be very cautious about are countries that are slowly trying to change the norms and doing it through democratic processes, because it looks very normal. Let's just change the words. Let's do this through a democratic vote that no one's paying attention to. But it's shifting the underlying values of our international system, and that is extremely dangerous for all of us maintaining the freedoms that we've been used to for a long time.
I think, if I very briefly, I think there's also a danger of pretending that this is just a conversation about what China does inside China, right? Or what Russia does inside Russia. And it's not. I think that what we're seeing right now is a war in Ukraine that's being fought basically to establish the right of one country to dictate the internal politics of another. Right? Just as that's happening on the military and political space, I think that what countries like China and others will find is that it won't be enough simply to control what people are aware of and thinking about and saying inside their own country. Right? It will be important to them because they perceive their interest to extend elsewhere in Asia, right? Or to have vital interests in Africa, right? Or other parts of the world, that it's not just about helping those regimes, right, learn how to use the technology, right? But it's also about extending their sense of security, right? Russia says we don't feel secure if Ukraine is governed in a certain way, right? There is, if we go down this road in cyberspace as well, right, it can become very, very dangerous indeed.
Great.
I think in the interest of time, we're just going to take one more question. So Dr. Sutter, if you'd like to call on someone.
You see, but the gentleman right here, right in front of me here. This dark shirt there. That's
okay. Hello, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. My name is Owen. I'm a first-year International Affairs and Political Science student here at George Washington. And just during this discussion, you guys kind of talked on how efficient China and other authoritarians are able to be, just having one or two people making decisions and kind of influencing on a global scale. I appreciate that. But what do we have as an option, as not only just the United States between our partisan infighting, but between the United States, European Union, Japan, South Korea, all the democracies of the world, to act united in kind of taking a more offensive stance of spreading freedom of information to these authoritarian countries that look to suppress it?
Yeah, I think democracies have a challenge globally because there has been a lot of division among democracies and a lot of slow bureaucracy that takes a lot of time to make decisions. There's been a lot of division sometimes between the United States and Europe. I think it's about leadership, and it's about our leaders recognizing the urgency of creating a unified stance against some of the authoritarian pressures. I do think the very, very unfortunate and horrific invasion of Ukraine has really elevated and brought to the awareness of many democracies that this is not the creeping authoritarianism is not a distant threat or a small threat, that it is a very, very real one that is on the doorstep of many countries. And so hopefully this is an opportunity for our leaders to come together to recognize that even if we have slightly different approaches to internet regulation, or we have that we need to find what we agree on and to pursue those things very aggressively. But I think it's a question of leadership at this point.
Look, I agree with that. I think that what looks like the efficiency or the effectiveness of authoritarian leaders really is a reflection of their ability to experiment and pivot in ways that democracies find difficult, right? Because we are inertial, we have to create consensus, right? We have to work across lines that sometimes are very hard to cross, whereas authoritarian leaders never face that pushback, right? So if they want to do something different, they can do that. But they're going to make mistakes, right? And that's I think where our advantage can come in, right? And that we can be more consistent than they, because they're going to see threats that they feel like they have to respond to, and then often their responses will be greater than maybe are justified, right? So I think that part of the answer to the question, in addition to the solidarity, is the consistency, right? Is to say, look, there are things that we want, and we can deal with the fact that sometimes an open and democratic and free information space is going to be an information space that has messages that we don't like, right? Or messages coming from countries that we don't like. But we're not out here to control the message, right? That's what the authoritarians do, right? If we start playing that game, then we do legitimize the things that they're trying to do, right? So we play the game that we're good at, which is the consistent game of having institutions, and we trust those institutions to work in the long run, right? And to provide the kinds of public and open spaces that we think are important, right? As long as we can stick to that, again, things I think we're better at sticking to, then I think we can outlast the problems.
And just a final point, I'm optimistic on the point because we have momentum now. It's taken a long time, but 5 years. But basically, we find the Congress, the majorities, bipartisan majorities in the Congress, and the executive branch are on the same page in this kind of issue on China, and particularly on China. And so this has come together. Read the national security strategy. And I think most people in Congress will say, yes, that's what we should be doing. And that's not usually the case with China. China's always been a cause of big differences between the executive branch and the Congress. No more. That's over. Plus, the impact of the situation in Ukraine has brought the Europeans in a very big way in line with what the United States is doing in dealing with these various aspects, the challenges from China. It's not just security, it's not just high tech, it's also governance. And in all of these areas, what we're talking about today is part of it. So I think we have a lot more unity now, and the momentum is strong. So this has really been a banner year. In 2022 will be a banner year in establishing a very firm American approach to China, which I think enjoys a lot broader support than it did maybe even 2 years ago. From the point of other allies and partners in Europe in particular. I think the European situation has changed a lot in that regard.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking our 3 expert speakers. This was really a wonderful To the 3 of you, from us at AHS and the George Washington University, thank you so much for your time today. This really was a special panel, a special topic, and we are very excited to continue the conference through today. We have talks coming up today on nuclear and missile strategy. We have our intelligence community career panel, and many, many more, and our 5:30 Future of War event. In addition, we have the lunch starting very soon in about 10 minutes upstairs in 405. If you're registered for that, we have your bowl of sweet green waiting for you. If you're not registered, you can wait, and after a couple minutes, if people don't come claim their bowls, maybe we will open them up and you can come get some food as well. So I want to thank you all for that. Please join me again in thanking our speakers for joining us today.